The history of modern Israel is a story shaped by conflict, aspiration, tragedy, and extraordinary transformation. Emerging from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, the land that would become Israel entered the 20th century under the British Mandate at a moment when global empires were crumbling, nationalism was ascendant, and the political map of the Middle East was being redrawn with lasting consequences. Over the following decades, waves of Jewish immigration, deepening tensions between Jewish and Arab communities, and competing national movements gradually intensified the struggle for sovereignty and identity in Palestine. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 marked a turning point not only in regional politics but in world history. It followed decades of ideological development within the Zionist movement, devastating losses during the Holocaust, and increasingly violent clashes over land, security, and political authority. From the earliest days of independence, Israel's survival and development were shaped by war, diplomacy, migration, and the complex challenge of building a democratic society amidst persistent external and internal pressures. Across the 20th and early 21st centuries, Israel evolved into a technologically advanced, economically vibrant nation, even as conflict with neighboring states, the unresolved Palestinian question, and shifting global alliances continued to define its political landscape. The modern history of Israel begins amid the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. For centuries, Ottoman rule had governed the diverse populations of Palestine, Muslims, Christians, and Jews through a system of relative local autonomy and imperial oversight. But by 1914, the empire was internally fragmented, economically weakened, and politically unstable. The strain of war delivered the final blow. British forces advanced across the Sinai, capturing Gaza and pressing northward, until Jerusalem fell on 9 December 1917. Ottoman authority, already eroded, collapsed almost entirely by the end of 1918. The war's end created a geopolitical vacuum across the Middle East, prompting the victorious Allied powers to decide the fate of the former Ottoman provinces through mandates, treaties, and diplomatic compromises. It was during this transformative period that the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a short but influential statement supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The declaration stemmed from a combination of wartime strategy, Christian Zionist sympathy, and the effective lobbying of Zionist leaders. Yet it immediately raised tensions, for the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, who had anticipated independence, saw it as a threat to their political future. Thus, even before international borders were formally redrawn, the foundations of a deeply contentious national struggle were already embedded in the political landscape. Following the war, the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate for Palestine, formalizing London's administrative authority and incorporating the Balfour Declaration into international obligations. The Mandate period became an era of profound transformation, notable for both the growth of the Jewish community and the intensification of Arab resistance. Jewish immigration, driven by European anti-Semitism, Zionist enthusiasm, and hopes of rebuilding a homeland, increased significantly. Each wave of immigrants brought new skills, ideas, and institutions. Socialists established kibbutzim, collectivist agricultural communities. Urban settlers built new towns and industries. The Jewish Agency, led by figures such as Chaim Weizmann and David ben-Guriomn, evolved into a quasi-government coordinating immigration, infrastructure, and diplomacy. A distinct cultural revival also emerged, with modern Hebrew becoming the spoken language of the growing Jewish community. Arab-Palestinian society, in contrast, experienced mounting anxiety and frustration. Initially fragmented along family and regional lines, Palestinians gradually organized around national concerns as land purchases and immigration reshaped the demographic landscape. The 1920s and early 1930s witnessed periodic outbreaks of violence, culminating in the widespread 1929 clashes rooted in disputes over sacred sites and economic grievances. The situation reached a boiling point with the Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939. This uprising, both nationalist and anti-colonial in nature, challenged British rule and sought to halt Jewish immigration. Britain responded with military force, political concessions, and eventually the 1939 White Paper, which severely limited Jewish immigration and land purchases. While intended to restore stability, the policy alienated Zionist leaders at precisely the moment when Europe's Jews were entering the darkest period of their history. The Second World War and the Holocaust profoundly altered the trajectory of the Zionist movement. 6 million Jews were murdered across Europe, entire communities destroyed, and survivors found themselves stateless and traumatized. For many, the hope of returning to pre-war homes vanished. The idea of a sovereign Jewish homeland was no longer an idealistic aspiration. It became, for countless refugees, a necessity. Yet Britain's 1939 restrictions remained in place, creating desperate situations for refugees attempting to reach Palestine by sea. Zionist resistance intensified. The Haganah organized clandestine immigration, while more militant groups such as Irgun and Lehi launched attacks on British targets. Tensions escalated as both Jewish and Arab communities, resentful of British policy, increasingly relied on violence to achieve political aims. Britain, weakened by the war and facing imperial decline, recognized that the mandate had become ungovernable. In 1947, London referred the issue to the newly formed United Nations, which eventually proposed the partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. Jewish leaders accepted the plan as a pragmatic path to independence. Arab leaders rejected it as unjust and illegitimate. On 14th May 1948, hours before Britain's withdrawal, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. The declaration marked the culmination of decades of Zionist effort and the beginning of an immediate regional war. Within hours, neighboring Arab states invaded, launching the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Israeli forces, though initially outnumbered and poorly equipped, gradually gained the upper hand. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel controlled more territory than the UN partition plan had allocated. The war produced two parallel, interwoven legacies. For Israelis, it represented survival and national rebirth after centuries of exile and persecution. For Palestinians, it marked the Nakba, the catastrophe, during which more than 700,000 became refugees, their villages depopulated or destroyed. The refugee crisis became one of the central unresolved issues of the conflict and a defining element of Palestinian identity. The armistice agreements created new borders but no permanent peace. Gaza came under Egyptian administration, the West Bank under Jordanian rule, and Jerusalem was divided. The political map of the early Cold War Middle East was set, but the core conflict remained unresolved. Israel's early years were defined by intense nation-building efforts under constant external pressure. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants and refugees poured in from Europe and the Middle East, doubling the population within a few years. Many arrived penniless and physically or emotionally scarred. The state undertook massive infrastructure projects, introduced food rationing, created transit camps, and sought to forge a cohesive society out of diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Politically, Israel established a parliamentary democracy dominated by the labor movement. Ben-Gurion's government built the foundations of the modern state: the Israel Defense Forces, nationalized industries, school systems, and welfare programs. At the same time, Israel faced continued hostility from its neighbors. Palestinian Fedayeen fighters launched cross-border raids. Israel responded with retaliatory operations, contributing to a cycle of violence that fueled regional tension. In 1956, Israel, facing Egyptian blockades and increasing guerrilla activity, joined Britain and France in attacking Egypt after Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Though militarily successful, Israel was compelled by US and Soviet pressure to withdraw, leaving a United Nations force in Sinai to monitor the border. The Suez Crisis revealed both Israel's military capabilities and the limitations imposed by Cold War superpower politics. The following decade saw escalating border conflicts with Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, as well as increasing Palestinian guerrilla activity. By 1967, the region was a tinderbox of mistrust, military mobilization, and diplomatic miscalculation. In June 1967, after months of rising tension, Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, expelled UN peacekeepers, and massed troops in Sinai. Viewing this as an existential threat, Israel launched preemptive strikes beginning the Six-Day War. In less than a week, Israel defeated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, capturing territories of immense strategic and symbolic significance: the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel's victory dramatically altered the political landscape. East Jerusalem, including the Old City, came under Israeli control, reigniting religious and national fervor. More than 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza came under Israeli military occupation, setting the stage for decades of dispute over land, sovereignty, and rights. The war shattered any illusion of short-term resolution. Instead, it created a new, enduring chapter defined by territorial occupation, settlement, displacement, and shifting political identities. Israel's sense of security after 1967 was profoundly tested in October 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. The early days of the war were marked by heavy Israeli losses, generating a deep national shock. Yet Israel eventually repelled the assault and pushed into enemy territory. The conflict reshaped Israeli politics, undermining public confidence in the Labour leadership and paving the way for Likud's rise in the 1977 elections. Meanwhile, the war convinced Egypt's President Anwar Sadat that territorial recovery required diplomacy rather than continual conflict. His historic 1977 visit to Jerusalem led to negotiations brokered by US President Jimmy Carter at Camp David. The resulting accords produced the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state in 1979. Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt recognized Israel's sovereignty. This breakthrough altered regional dynamics and demonstrated that negotiated peace was possible, though it also contributed to Sadat's assassination by extremists opposed to reconciliation. Simultaneously, new social and political forces were transforming Israel internally. The post-1967 settlement movement grew rapidly, driven by religious conviction and nationalist ideology. The ideological debate over the future of the West Bank and Gaza became one of the most divisive issues in Israeli society, shaping elections, court rulings, and government policies for decades to come. By the early 1980s, escalating cross-border attacks by the Palestine Liberation Organization led Israel to launch an invasion of Lebanon in 1982. The initial objective of pushing PLO forces away from the northern border soon expanded into a broader conflict involving Beirut and Lebanese factions. The war became increasingly controversial, particularly after the Sabra and Shatila massacre carried out by Lebanese Christian militiamen allied with Israel. Israel's prolonged presence in southern Lebanon eroded public support for the conflict, which continued until Israeli withdrawal in 2000. The late 1980s saw another turning point with the eruption of the First Intifada in 1987. This Palestinian uprising, driven by long-standing resentment toward occupation and socio-economic hardship, captured global attention with scenes of mass protests, strikes, and civil disobedience. The uprising challenged Israeli assumptions about the permanence of its control and galvanized international pressure for a negotiated solution. These dynamics set the stage for the 1993 Oslo Accords. Under the leadership of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres in Israel, and Yasser Arafat in the PLO, both sides recognized each other formally and agreed to a phased process toward a two-state solution. The creation of the Palestinian Authority, along with coordinated security arrangements and partial Israeli withdrawals, appeared to herald a new era. The iconic handshake on the White House lawn symbolized global optimism. But the optimism proved fragile. Extremists on both sides rejected compromise. Hamas and Islamic Jihad carried out suicide bombings inside Israel. Israeli settlement expansion continued. Trust eroded. In 1995, Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist opposed to territorial concessions. Many historians view his death as a decisive blow to the peace process. In 2005, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon initiated a unilateral disengagement from Gaza, dismantling all Israeli settlements and military installations there. The move aimed to reduce friction and reshape Israel's strategic posture, but it produced profound political controversy within Israel. Soon afterward, Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections and, following a bitter internal struggle with Fatah, seized control of Gaza. The Palestinian territories became politically divided, with the Palestinian Authority governing the West Bank and Hamas ruling Gaza. This division contributed to repeated cycles of violence between Israel and Hamas. Major conflicts erupted in 2008-9, 2012, 2014, and later escalations, culminating most dramatically in the aftermath of the October 7, 2023 Hamas attacks on Israel, which triggered a devastating war in Gaza. These conflicts inflicted enormous suffering, displaced populations, destroyed infrastructure, and intensified international scrutiny and political polarization. Meanwhile, Israel has undergone significant internal upheaval. Political instability has produced repeated elections, shifting alliances, and heated debates over the nature of democracy, the authority of the judiciary, the place of religion in public life, and the rights of minorities. Benjamin Netanyahu has dominated much of this era, becoming Israel's longest-serving prime minister, admired by supporters for his economic and security policies, and criticized by opponents for fostering polarization and eroding democratic norms. Despite political turbulence, Israel has achieved remarkable technological and economic advancement. The country has become a global center for innovation, pioneering developments in cybersecurity, medical research, agricultural technology, and artificial intelligence. The startup nation narrative has become a defining feature of contemporary Israeli identity, even as socio-economic disparities persist. Regionally, the landscape shifted in 2020 with the Abraham Accords. Israel normalized relations with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, driven by shared concerns such as Iran's regional influence and mutual economic interests. These agreements signaled a historic realignment in the Middle East, showing that some Arab states were willing to engage with Israel even without a resolution to the Palestinian question. The history of modern Israel is a story of extraordinary ambition and enduring struggle. It is the tale of a people seeking to rebuild a homeland after centuries of diaspora and persecution, and of another people who experienced dispossession and displacement in the same historical moment. It is a narrative filled with triumphs and traumas, wars and negotiations, democratic vitality, and profound internal tensions. Israel today stands as a complex, dynamic state, technologically advanced, culturally diverse, militarily powerful, diplomatically engaged, and politically divided. Its future will depend on how it navigates the unresolved challenges inherited from a century of conflict and how it manages the ever-shifting forces of regional and global politics. The legacy of the past remains deeply influential, shaping debates over identity, legitimacy, sovereignty, and justice. And yet, the story of Israel remains open-ended. its next chapter unwritten, shaped by the decisions, aspirations, and struggles of the generations who continue to live in the land where history, faith, and modern nationhood intersect. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to Blistering History.